for the owners. So you can read more details there, but I think the discussion I'm interested in having with all of you from all your different perspectives is what we raised here was a lot of concerns about increased costs, both administrative costs, actual retrofit costs, and operating costs. And sort of as we work to understand the impacts of this policy, what should the expectations be from an affordable housing perspective? That you know, the feedback was there's no extra money basically in that affordable housing owners have. So is the expectation that the policy should have some way to provide funding or connection to funding to support all of these additional possible costs and burdens, or not, or so. And this in this case, affordable housing is a unique sector. So I'm just going to open up. Robert seems to have a comment.
Well, yeah, it's a comment and observation. I think you got to understand the tax credit. You know, like there's only two real points where you can fund it, right? It's at the very beginning and at the refi or exit or whatever you want to call it. When the LP is recapitalized out of the tax credit LP is recapitalized out of the asset. That happens some point between year 11 and 16 or something like that. So, Washington State Housing Finance certainly can do their part if they want to on the front end of requiring, certain elements to be in order for people to receive, credits. But I don't think the policy is going to be able to implement restrictions or requirements on affordable housing owners during a credit compliance period because they can't get approval of the limited partner to do a refi early, and no LP is going to step up and fund it. So, whatever the policy is, it has to allow for the variability that that requirement of recapitalization can't require them to do it prior to the end of their compliance period, or they'll be in violation of all their docs. In terms of money available, I mean, I've run numbers on, 50 deals now in the last 90 days. And energy retrofits work at a capital event. They don't work. Deep energy retrofits don't work without some carbon tax or something. It really just doesn't. At least not in our area. They may work in other areas, or they may work where there's subsidy involved of some way, shape, or form.
Eli, any perspective from a finance commission, either the tax credit side or your fund side? Any thoughts to throw in this?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with Robert about any buildings that are in the tax credit compliance period. There certainly needs to be accommodation for them. It does seem like without any sort of incentive dollars added into this policy, then we need to lean more towards exempting affordable housing than allowing it to continue in this policy. Unless there is some sort of caveat that it only would apply at a resyndication event. Otherwise, it would be exempt. It would seem to be the direction we're heading. If there's I didn't realize there wasn't just the opportunity for incentive dollars to be on the table here.
Oh, there is.
Oh.
Yeah, and I'm not ruling. Nothing is off the table.
Yeah.
Okay, absolutely nothing. This is making recommendations. I think the question I was asking is, almost what should the ask be? You know, we don't have to solve all the problems, right? But I think we've been asked to get the voice of the affordable housing community. So if the affordable housing community says, we can't afford this, or we can't afford it during this period, you know, we can share some ideas where the money might come from, but we could say to the Office of Sustainability, the affordable housing community can't afford it. If you're going to do this, find some money.
Yeah, I guess I'd be curious, like what like Marty and I right now are working on a project, Steve, that you know about for a bunch of bellwether properties. So I guess I would be curious, like, I suppose it comes down to like, is this level of work that these bellwether properties are going to undergo, would those be something, I guess we don't know enough about what the standard would be, but would this level of work bring it in compliance with the standard? And then if so, it does seem like perhaps that could pencil, you know, with a sustainable energy trust loan. But if I'd imagine what the work Marty's done is probably had, you know, the cash flow from these savings be right on about the edge, you know, of what the sustainable energy trust loan terms are. So, you know, if it's more than that, yeah, then what are we going to do, I suppose?
And I just want to clarify, we don't know, and that's why we're doing the audits. And I suspect the answer is going to be sometimes it will pay for itself and sometimes it might not.
Yeah.
Hunch, but Jen, I'm going to bring you in.
I wanted to make a point. Elliot, I think you had used the term, or Eli, I'm sorry. I think you had used the term incentive, but I think we actually shouldn't use that term here, because incentives are what it, you know, essentially what you have to provide to incentivize someone to do something that's not required, but preferred. And in this particular circumstance, and, you know, often that can be like, it's, you're trying to calculate an incentive to be just enough to like kind of tip the balance, right? To encourage someone to do something that they otherwise would not. But here, you know, we're talking about something that is a requirement, or that will be a requirement, that will, and I really appreciated your summary here around the different types of costs, Steve, that will likely mean that the affordable housing provider will incur additional costs. And so we really have to think of this as not an incentive, but just straight out funding to help offset the additional costs. And I think that here that language is really important, because it is maybe a more appropriate description of the scale, and also I think what we, you know, the situation.
Robert, did you have another question or comment?
Yeah, it seems to me that like it may be a combination of the you know, the subsidy or capital associated with it, along with something, whether it's Washington State Housing Finances Fund or whatever, and you do that prior to the capital event. So on the capital event can then take advantage of, you know, on cap rate, LTV, debt service coverage, or whatever, you know, of the improved value, because that's the only way you get actual real value. If you look at it as a payback from cash flow, that's really difficult to do on an affordable housing project. Particularly when a nonprofit, which is usually trying to service the tenant bases that are actually at the lower end, you know, from 60% to 50% to 40% AMI versus just everybody at 60. If it's all at 60, it's actually a little easier to do. But, you know, that's not necessarily the case in all these projects. So it does seem to work, at least in the math I've been running, that if you can do the retrofit enough in advance of the capital event, the recap at that next juncture 3 years from now or whatever, you can pick up a fair amount of the cost. I think we need some better solar, you know, policy here. We need some net metering, or sorry, some virtual private meters. You know, that would do a lot. You know, because right now solar is really difficult on a you know, individually metered project. Is almost impossible.
Yep. Sandra?
Yeah, I was just going to, in response to Eli's question, we don't know the targets. I think that's true, but I just keeping in mind the end game is net zero emissions buildings. So, you know, getting, transitioning off of fossil fuels with efficiency so that, we have high performing buildings but I was curious in listening to this discussion, like and there's probably no typical, but like in a resyndication and a recapitalization, what would that work often include? Like, and so, with the question about what's the increment above and beyond that getting to net zero emissions might require.
I think that's what the audits are going to demonstrate, because I don't think that's been anyone's target today. Am I wrong? I mean,
I can give you my comments on all the ones that we've analyzed really it boils down to the age of the building. If it's something that's kind of a mid 90s and later construction, kind of 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, kind of and later. Those are I don't know if I'd call those a deep energy retrofit. Anything like older than that, particularly the city of Seattle is going to have a lot more that are older than that, where a lot of what I was looking at is in other areas of the state of Washington. I think it's going to be a little more challenging. I think you're going to see that need for a lot more of the envelope and the more costly elements, and so I don't know how that math works right now. I mean, really don't.
I think my experience is that a lot of the effort is we want to do what's cost effective. So we want to support reducing energy use, reducing carbon, but only if it pays for itself. So the projects have been based on that. Whereas what we're saying now, they're going to be based on a finite metric to be net zero carbon and efficient. So some of them may have complied just because it was all had good payback. I think many of them, certainly the electrification part, wouldn't. And in the audits that Alistair's going to talk about in a couple of minutes. Want to be careful on time. Bambi, are we over time already? And do we need to wrap this up? We're okay. Okay, Jen.
So I have a couple of thoughts. I think, Robert, and I have to say that I'm not the capital investments manager, OH. So Lori, if she was here, would know more. But I mean, I think what I hear you saying, Robert, is that the resyndication provides an opportunity for capital to pay for the costs of these projects, but it still increases the overall project cost, right? I mean, and I am not clear that resyndication, I mean, I'm thinking about this with my public funder hat on. I mean, you still are seeing an increase in project costs. And so there still needs to be public funding available to pay for that increase in project costs, right? Like we can't assume that the resyndication would take care of that without some kind of additional public subsidy, which might have an impact on resources, the finite pool of resources that's available for both new production and preservation.
Yeah, I think you're
I
only
think part of the question of what you're resyndicating it with what finance mechanisms and with what kind of housing. Because the other thing that was brought up by some of the folks who work on permanent supportive housing is they have no income at all. There is no rent. So
yeah, that's right.
You can't like pass it on or capture it with utility what I'm blanking on the term. Anyway, claw back on the utility expenses.
Utility allowances.
Utility allowances. Thank you, Eli. I should know that one. So that's, and then tax credits can be essentially free money, if I'm reading correctly, but lending certainly isn't.
And tax credits are typically, at least for new investments, and maybe Becky, you can help me out of this hole, but like they pay for a portion of the project, but not the whole project. And I don't know if that's also equally true at resyndication. Others on this call could answer that question better than I.
Becky, help us.
Yes, that there. I mean, basically, it's a 30 to 70, right? If you want to run it, 9% new construction, you get a lot more equity. 4% resyndication, you get a lot more debt.
If they come back in and they reapply, if they come back in as a retrofit for tax credits, after year 15, they can, receive a new round if they qualify.
Becky. Hi.
Yeah, I think I was just going to offer that to Sandra's point, like the big recapitalizations around here are typically buildings, you know, older than 95, and they are they are usually envelope window systems oriented. So that is a good thing. So, you know, a lot of the nonprofits are tracking these systems that are failing in certain ways, and you know, it's just the extent to which they're failing determines when they can get to it, along with the financing streams. In many cases, owners are trying to just shift to sole ownership, so not resyndicating and just maybe refinancing into a new bank loan. And so in that case, you have more flexibility. And I think in the past, this is be putting on old developer hat, I think, you know, one of the workarounds from trying to introduce new money into a project that might be in a partnership situation is if you can work through the nonprofit. So bundling, you know, having the money and the more cash, the better, of course. So whether it's the city or City Light or private foundation money that could come together around this. But, you know, if there is a pot of funds available that could be distributed to the nonprofit as a intermediary, and then they're bringing it into projects and working with their investors to understand those impacts. I think that's been done in the past, maybe, but it could be worth consulting a Novogradac or someone about that. So that could be an option. And Steve, I know you've done some of these projects. And
So I think what I'm hearing is just like there's a lot of attention spent on new construction to putting the capital stack together. Essentially what we're saying is many buildings in the affordable housing portfolio will need upgrades, some minor, some major, and understanding the sources of funding and how they all play together will be critical to determine the impact on affordable housing.
yeah, I think
without giving any answers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last thing to say is, you know, I think, yeah, supportive housing really has like almost no resources to bring to this in terms of debt capacity. And so they needed kind of as much pre-money as possible. But I think with time to comply, you know, nonprofit owners could leverage other resources. So if it's sort of a 50-50 match, or, you know, like, yeah, the city, a City Light, others could come up with a fund that would fund 50%. I think, I mean, I hesitate to say it, but depending on the scope, you know, some of the nonprofits out there could leverage resources or bring reserves to the table, or, you know, there's a host of options there.
Let me ask one question before we move on, and that would be, we expect affordable housing owners to invest in the maintenance and upkeep of their buildings generally. So eventually windows fail, and not to say affordable housing don't struggle, but they struggle for how they're going to replace the windows, and that might be a refinance, might be a resyndication, whatever. This policy may require that, or ask to go to triple pane windows to hit the EUI goal rather than double pane windows. But some of that investment in maintaining the building would have been made already by affordable housing. Same thing with, you know, replacing a gas boiler. Maybe it has to become an electric heat pump or a VRF system of some kind. So should we be looking at the delta between where we have been of maintaining buildings and where this is going to take us? Is that the way to look at this? Marty.
I was just going to say, I mean, you and I've talked about it, and clearly we're open to the notion of electrifying our buildings where it's feasible. But when we're talking about resyndication and refinancing, it's a pool of money that is generally addressing a pool of deferred maintenance that has just been left. And it's figuring out what are the priorities. And the first priority is always what's going to keep the building standing up. And so these utility upgrades, while we can say, well, let's go to a higher grade window, or let's go to, you know, a better insulation or something like that, if it's added cost, it depletes that pool of money that we were applying to a lot of stuff that needs to get done. So it's still an issue of, is there enough money available to do these projects?
Okay. We're not trying to answer this right now, so I think we've
Oh, yeah.
sort of posing the questions. But I think what I got out of this is we're starting to surface some of the different scenarios that we can start to put together of timing, what is expected of normal maintenance versus other different kinds of buildings, permanent supportive versus other. So I think what we'll start to do is maybe first frame the questions better and then start to look for solutions. And as I said, Sandra, correct me if I'm wrong, some of this may be feedback to the policy that says, this is what the affordable housing community would like and can afford. And don't necessarily have all the answers of how to do it.
No, that's absolutely right. I think this is a really great conversation, and, you know, sort of, I think some of the comments, especially, it's like, you can't, you know, if you're in a tax credit compliance period, you have limitations. And so, you know, that can feed into how we design the policy around affordable housing. So.
Okay, Bambi, I think this may be a good point to move on to our next agenda item.
Yeah, so that will just be going back to Sandra. But then I would just want to remind everyone, you were sent the document that kind of summarized the research. So if you haven't had a chance to look that over, that's something for you to, you know, to own. And if you have questions, certainly reach out. And then Sandra, you're going to go ahead and talk about the timeline scenario and see what we can get from that conversation.
Sure. Let's see here. I am hopefully sharing. There we go. It sounded like there've been, you know, from the last discussion, some follow-up questions on our process and our time frame. So I'll just do a quick review and then happy to hear questions. And also, if this, you know, particular issue is on top of mind, if there are others that we want to discuss, open to that as well. But I've just sort of bring this diagram back up from some previous presentations, and, you know, just to note that our process for this policy is that we are trying to bring a draft policy recommendation to the mayor's office by the 1st of July. Specifically in our directive, we're supposed to be bringing a draft ordinance, but we are looking at that fairly broadly. And, you know, so by policy package, I mean, you know, what might go in an ordinance, what might go in a rule, what kind of funding needs might there be? So sort of, you know, we can provide recommendations to the mayor's office about how we think this policy should be shaped. From there, it will continue to be iterated through the mayor's office and others. And then we go to a council process. And our thinking at this point and our understanding, but it's always, you know, variable when you're looking at mayoral and council processes, would be that there would be legislation this fall to enact a building performance standard policy. Some of the details would be in an ordinance that would get passed this fall. And then many of the details would be figured out in rulemaking, which would happen in 2023. So, you know, the first step is recommendations to the mayor's office. The second step is legislation through the council process, you know, tentatively by the end of 2022, and then rulemaking in 2023 to work out particular details. And then the timing for the policy itself would begin, compliance would begin in 2026, but we are, part of our work is to figure out, begin with whom and begin with what. And that compliance would be phased in over, 15, 25 years, so that, it's not like in 2026, everybody has to meet a particular standard or every building has to come up to a certain performance. And that part of our, what we is good to hear from all of you on is sort of what else is needed besides just a regulation, right? So that I think I'm gonna, and then I'm just, a few updates. We have started our technical advisory group process, and Alistair and Bobby are both part of that group. We have our second meeting tomorrow. The first meeting, we talked at people a lot. And so tomorrow we're hoping to start getting lots of good input. We have a public open house that we are planning for March 22nd. So expect invitations to that. And so that will be broad and open. And we've set up series of meetings with labor representatives, and we're also working with our Department of Neighborhoods on connecting with residential tenants and small business tenants. So I'm gonna unshare and then see what kind of questions folks have.
Sandra, I just want to add one thing I forgot to mention, but that it may relate to your general timeline as well. As I mentioned, most of the folks represented at our meeting earlier were of the larger housing providers. And we need to reach out to small housing providers that have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 buildings. And their requirements, the requirements would be the same, but the impact on their organizations could look quite a bit different. And that might also relate to the general ownership of multifamily housing in the city, affordable and non-affordable. So
yeah, that's a good, thank you for that. And then also just noting that, this task force and this process is really valuable in providing input on subsidized housing. We are also trying to identify where there's, whatever you want to call it, naturally occurring affordable housing or unsubsidized lower rent housing, and trying to reach out to some of those owners and also to tenants.
Are we exclusively talking about timeline right now? I just want to clarify, we're asking questions or making comments on timeline.
I think it's whatever you think is going to be helpful. Was there something in that timeline that struck a chord for you or made you think of something? We're just a brain dump here. We're going for it all. So
I know HDC is at the table for these meetings, but I'm wondering what other sort of advocacy organizations around housing might need to be engaged or also here in general. But I also know that there's activity at the state level around Senate Bill 5722 or something like that, around the state standard. And our intergovernmental folks are asking questions about what that means for us. And there's some confusion about, does complying with ESDS already meet that goal? And I just think there's maybe some more informational opportunities that might be helpful from a timeline perspective that are geared directly towards housers that might have questions about what compliance means for them. I understand we're supposed to be like a representative group of folks, but like AWA, the folks I'm talking about is AWA, and they have like a lobbyist that's working at the state level, right? And I don't know how engaged they are in city level policy, but I imagine at the city level, there's other small groups that are also interested, and I don't know how we intend to engage them, or maybe that's an expectation of us as members of this group. But I'd be interested to hear where advocacy groups outside of HDC fit into the communication plan and sort of information sharing. And I was late, so maybe I missed something.
I can say from the city perspective, there is, reaching out to the Rental Housing Association, and Nicole can maybe fill in with some other acronyms. We actually talked about condo owners, just not necessarily as an affordability issue, but it's a sort of a different building type. If you have particular organizations you can think of that we should be talking to, would love to hear them. And it sounds like there's also a little bit of like, there's both, what is the city thinking of in terms of a policy, but also then what's happening on the state level, and education and outreach really around the state standard, and probably in some ways, waiting to see what happens with the legislation and how much of that is needed.
Yeah, Bobby, just chiming in here, if you have suggestions, definitely send them on to me. And you said an acronym earlier, and I didn't jot it down, and it was like AW, what was that group?
Oh, I don't even know if I'm saying this right, but it's AWA. I think it's the Association of Washington Housing Authorities, which is, I know SHA and KCHA are members of that, but I don't know that the membership is open to nonprofit housers. But,
okay, that's thanks.
Nicole, you may have already had this on your list, but I would reach out to the Rental Housing Association, but also the Washington Multifamily Housing Association. RHA generally is known as sort of representing smaller landlords, and the Washington Multifamily Housing Association is known as sort of representing the larger ones. So I think it would make sense to engage with both.
Thanks. Yeah, that was one. That was the W one was the one I think Sandra might have been thinking of, but I always forget their acronym. So yes, yeah, definitely.
So I have a timing question too, like, again, talking about all of the, like, you're in the tax credit compliance period. Are there any common deadlines, or is it really building by building?
It's common. Based on the year the building was placed in service.
It's building by building. It's not like everyone updates their buildings in 2025.
That was my question. Yeah.
Yeah, no.
And receiving new tax credits would be compliant on an award from the Housing Finance Commission. So, which is, as we all know now, like so competitive and oversubscribed. So even if a building's ready to resyndicate and receive new tax credits, it might not be able to.
And Eli, on a related note, not all affordable housing has tax credits in it either, right? So some of this will be relevant.
Oh, sure.
And some won't. And, I think I mentioned that to Steve as well. I think trying to get, there's tax credit projects, there's projects with OH funding in them, that there's also a universe of projects that has neither, right? That, have those HUD mortgages. And so I think when we say affordable housing, having clarity about what that means. And I think an understanding of the different fund sources or restrictions that they might be operating under due to those fund sources.
Yeah, with the commission, it's usually when we say affordable housing, we assume we're talking about tax credits.
The trick, but most other affordable housing, the timeline of restrictions is shorter. So you may have a mortgage and a HUD mortgage or a HAP contract or whatever, but you actually can do things with inside of 10 years in those. Whereas the low-income housing tax credit, you're kind of toast for 10 plus years.
Jen, thanks for your comment on affordable housing definitions. It's one I think I've struggled with a bit as we've tried to do some definition work with our benchmarked buildings. Is there something that can be referred to, or is that something this group could provide to have some of those different types of buckets that affordable housing might fall into? Just wondering if there's kind of a common dictionary you can refer
That
to.
we use, you know, especially when we're looking at like the land use code and some exceptions for affordable housing. So I can share that with you, Nicole, and that might
Okay.
be a starting place. And I think it generally captures, as Robert says, you know, housing that is affordable for the long term, that has a long-term regulatory agreement on it, and that is primarily serving low-income tenants.
I can tell you this, the National Trade Group, you know, those groups, they basically categorize it in three. It's low-income housing tax credit, public housing, and subsidized Section 8.
We have a broader universe than that. I mean, there's OH-funded projects that have a 75-year regulatory agreement on them that don't quite fit into any of those categories. So just wanting to have it broad enough to capture some of those.
You know, we don't have to categorize things as affordable housing. We can have all the things that make them affordable, and the policy can refer to those. So, you know, if it's in a tax credit period, the policy could say, here's what happens. If it has an agreement restricting rents, it could say, if it's restricting rents and it's under 20% of AMI, here's what happens. You know, so we don't have to, it sounds like there are gonna be different, there may be a need for different aspects of the policy for different parts of affordable housing anyway. So we may not call anything affordable housing. We may just.
Yeah, there's 23 federal programs. There's, I mean, you can keep going, right? You know, however many state ones, city ones, you go on and on.
Should we move
So
on?
I was just going to say, if there are no sort of particular timing, timing related questions, I'm totally open to any other questions, for the city or input to the city, but also we could always move on to Alistair and talking about the audit process if that made sense. So.
I have a really general question. It's more of an ask. So at SHA, as we're trying to get our arms around what compliance with a policy like this might mean for us and some general idea of what it might cost us. One of the things that's come up is that through refinancing strategy and about 20 years ago, we converted a lot of our electrical systems to natural gas systems and made use of, I believe, Office of Housing funds or some other kind of utility rebates to do that. And I don't know if in the research or the policy development, if there's a plan to look at like, what is the sort of value of those investments that were made and who contributed to it, and have we gotten like the full life cycle out of those pieces of equipment? Because I know that is inevitably a question that's going to come up for me from our CFO when we look at the dollar amount, because I think it's going to be significant. And I'm kind of curious, like what the, like how would we from a policy standpoint answer that question, that we're making the best use of public funds to like enforce conversion back to electric for those buildings that we spent or refinanced in order to make those investments 20 years ago, oftentimes at the guidance of like city and utility folks, right? So is my question making sense? Am I making sense? Like,
Yeah, I mean, your question makes great sense, at least to me. And I think, I don't know, it is it's sort of at some, I mean, part of what this policy is intended to do is accelerate the, you know, asset management cycle, and that you would actually be replacing equipment before the end of its useful life, potentially, right? Otherwise, that would be covered by the energy code. So there is, I mean, there is an intent to accelerate the transition, you know, up faster than what's happening currently. But I think, you know, this question about where is equipment in its life cycle, and what kind of, you know, I think your point too about like what money was used to put that equipment in place is relevant. And I know with our own city facilities, that's part of our planning process. So we're working on electrification strategy to be all, you know, decarbonized by 2035. And so there's definitely acceleration of, you know, sort of equipment replacements, but also at the same time, like what are the ones that were going to be replaced in the next capital improvement cycle in any case, right? And then sort of moving things forward. So I guess I'm wondering if part of this process is the more like, and I don't know if it's on a like example portfolio basis or something, or, but like, what do you know about your equipment and when it's intended to be replaced or expected to fail, or, you know, what like the more we know about what's the expected life cycle of the equipment in these portfolios, I think it will help us to consider that, because I think that's right. And there's also, you know, one consideration too is how do we address portfolios of buildings, like buildings owned by the same owner? Like, does every building need to be on the same, like, let's say, does every building need to reduce emissions by 50% by X date? Or can the portfolio have emissions reduced by 50% by X date, in which case that might help to get at that. So that, you know. So I'm going to throw it back at you a little bit, you all, to like, the more you can tell us about like, well, our portfolio is all buildings that were built in 2020, and we're not going to replace anything until, you know, we wouldn't typically replace it until X date, or what's the range, you know?
Well, and then one of the questions about portfolio, some building owners have portfolios that are mostly buildings built before 1950, and some portfolios are mostly buildings built after 2010. So is that equitable from owner to owner if it's a portfolio standard? To comment on something Bobby said earlier, you know, Bobby, you asked, what is it going to cost SHA? I think we should phrase that as two different questions. What's it going to cost? And what's it going to cost SHA? So first we have to figure out what it's going to cost. And then part of our challenge is to figure out who's going to pay for it. And I think part of our objective here is to really ask if, you know, what is the expectation for affordable housing to pay for, and what should society pay for to invest in climate, our climate work and our housing, right? And you know, I'm not assuming that those two costs are the same. I'm assuming they're not, in fact, to some extent. I don't know how much. So
I think that's a good point, Steve. And I guess I'm pointing to those projects that we did 15 or so years ago, where I think the ethic was the same behind that, right? That it's not just, it wasn't just us that made those investments. It was the community, or, you know, whoever was paying into the taxes or whatever that covered the cost of that. So I have a little bit of trauma related to this, because I've been resource conservation manager for a long time, and have had school buildings where we've made all sorts of like utility funded investments that then are completely renovated and rehabilitated using bond dollars just a few years later. So it's like, I have some trauma around that, and I'm just going to name it and say that that exists. So I have like anxiety about this, but I guess to respond to your question, Sandra, about the equipment and replacement timelines, I think it, again, depends on the housing program type, whether or not there are reserves that cover the replacement of it that are sufficiently funded or not. In public housing, we're usually trying to squeeze every little last breath out of everything before we replace it. And so it's a really difficult question to answer with any level of like certainty that like this hot water tank we would replace in 2035 and you're asking us to replace in 2028 or whatever the timeline would be. Because if it's sort of the mindset of like, if it's not broke, don't fix it kind of thing. Or if it's not failing, don't replace it. And I think those, while it's scary to say those things out loud, that is the reality. I don't know if that the same is true for all tax credit property operators or owners, but for our public housing buildings, that tends to be the case. We're trying to eke out as much as we can from them. And I think there's, in the public housing community in particular, I think there's this ongoing conversation about like, what is the future of public housing? Because we have seen over the last X amount of years, a huge investment through tax credits. You know, my favorite question to ask non-housing people is, how is the bulk of affordable housing in the United States funded? Most people think HUD, but it's actually the IRS. And I think it's like a nugget that's important because for some of these buildings, particularly these large high rises, I'm not certain they're going to be around for another 50 years. I hope they are, or that they are under some program. But that's the reality for public housing in particular, that the sort of how long into the future are we planning for is really in question. So I don't know if that made sense, but it's a challenging issue for us.
So I think this is exactly what we're looking for is, right? We're just throwing it out there. We're seeing what's coming up and all of this is going to inform. So thank you all for adding your voices. We're getting just a couple of minutes to the next junction here with Alistair giving us his update and figuring out how we feel about that. Just a couple of things to note. I will ask Sandra to give me a PDF of the timeline, so I will send that out with the notes. I will also resend again Steve's summary, although you will have already had that in your invitation for today. So I will definitely be providing notes, and then that way you can remember what was said here and have the documents. But I think unless there's anything else pertaining particularly to this kind of scenario or something that just needs to get out there right now for Sandra's ears, because this is her moment, then we would probably be moving forward to Alistair.
I'm going to add one thing on top of Bobby, because I think he's absolutely right about the mindset. And I wonder if, I know we talked about affordable housing just getting a waiver, which could be easier, but I wonder if you switch to more of a best effort mindset. So saying like, if you don't meet the threshold, so if the threshold's 32 EUI or whatever it is, then you go into this best effort and with some funding available for it. And similar, I mean, I kind of go to the Built Smart program a little bit, or some of the other incentive programs, Jennifer said with an asterisk, but like some of the programs that have been available from the city have been very much menu-based. And so, you know, can you go to kind of a menu-based approach, which, you know, some of the folks that work in building are used to with C406 menus. That's a little more maybe sophisticated than what we're talking about, but you know, can you do window upgrades? Here's funding that's available. Can you do roof upgrades? You know, what are the things that are feasible in this building of this certain age, and regulatory restriction layers, or financing layers. So, but even a best effort and sort of, you know, go through a process of understanding what might be feasible at the building.
I agree with that, Becky. And I think that does put us more in the incentive territory if it wasn't a requirement, but there was more, you for affordable housing, the structure was more around incentives, like what can we offer that can help tip people or, tip property owners to be able to opt for something, I guess that would, as you say, Sandra, really just speed up the timeline. So eventually the energy code is going to require it, but what could we do to incentivize folks to do it faster or ahead of when the equipment is at the end of its useful life? And so I kind of like that approach that's more, because I've appreciated your point in the past, Sandra. We don't want to just exempt affordable housing and be like, okay, in 50 years, affordable housing is going to be like the gas guzzling dinosaurs and everything else is going to be upgraded. But I think just a straight requirement presents a lot of challenges. So can we acknowledge affordable housing as having its own unique challenges and create more of an incentive structure that can help get them there faster without mandating it, and creating a lot of other repercussions?
You're muted, Steve.
Yep, sorry. I was just going to reiterate that point about exemption could have other negative impacts. Both policies like this could have significant impact on gas prices down the road, and we don't want affordable housing to be stuck holding that. Yeah, but the other thing incentives can do, or menus, is allow us to, and whether we're spending public money or affordable housing money or wherever, to spend the money where it's going to be most effective. It may be most effective to upgrade a 10-year-old building and get it to net zero than to play around with a 50-year-old building. So, can we develop a system that self-regulates that rather than dictate that? It just says, like a lot of the state policies say, do all cost-effective energy efficiency. That's what I-937 says. So is there something like that in affordable housing, and defines what that is? So some buildings get to be super clean and some just don't get there, especially whether we're spending private housing money or public money. It just is not a good way to spend money. We can build another, we can plant more trees, maybe cheaper than we can retrofit one of Marty's old buildings.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I know Alistair brought this up in a separate email communication, but we've talked like, what's the value proposition in terms of, cost per carbon unit saved?
Yeah, that was kind of the point I was going to make too, is that it's just, I think it's going to be really important that we look at where can we actually have an impact and where are we just squeezing blood out of a stone, and really focus on where the impacts are.
I just wanted to extend some gratitude to Becky and Jennifer for being solutions oriented, and when I came out of the gate with some real negativity. So thank you.
Bobby, I just want to say that I share your pain of having spent HomeWise dollars to install electric oil furnaces that we then ripped out a few years later. I mean, you're just like, ah! So I may not have the same level of trauma.
I share the pain. We ripped out electric furnaces and put in gas furnaces 10 years ago in residential buildings.
All right, well, I'm going to move us forward on to Alistair, because I am also incredibly curious to see where we are. So if that feels good for everyone, we're going to go ahead and transition forward.
Great. I'm glad we bought about 10 minutes, because in the middle of that conversation, suddenly my computer just melted down and everything disappeared. So it's taken me until a couple of minutes ago to find everything that I was looking at and prep for this. So great conversation, well timed. So as far as audit scope is concerned, we're, as I said, I think in the last meeting, we're a little behind where I had hoped we are, but we now have a set of roughly 60 buildings that we're looking at that we have, I think, good data on. And we have started prioritizing. I guess just to take a step back and just remind everybody, the intent of the audit process is really ground truthing. It's, you know, quality control of the information to make sure that the data that we're looking at is good. It's making sure that we know everything, having identified a set of buildings to audit, that we have access to all the information that already exists on those buildings, and then ground truthing to understand and make sure that what we think the building is doing when we look at its performance numbers is actually what's going on in reality, and to then identify, you know, what are the opportunities and challenges in getting those buildings from their current performance to whatever the appropriate target that is at the end of the day. So that's sort of the overall goal. We've been kind of developing typologies for the building types that are represented across the whole inventory of affordable housing in the city, to identify a set of representative prototypes, if you like, and then look in the data to find buildings that represent those, that we can actually get on the ground and audit. And as I say, we've drilled down to a set of about 55 or 60 buildings now. And of that, I think I've identified 15. We haven't quite finalized the mix yet, but we're looking at something like 4 or 5 all electric buildings and 10 or 11 mixed fuel buildings, gas and electric buildings. And actually, I made a note, Bobby's point's an interesting one, that there may be buildings that are now mixed fuel, but which started out as all electric, which is something that we should be thinking about in terms of the capacity question. So the electric infrastructure capacity questions is one of the big questions to be thinking about in this whole conversation. And so obviously buildings that were originally all electric and then became mixed fuel are a kind of interesting subset in themselves that we have some information about that we might not see from the background data.
Also, might that be related to age of construction, to date of construction? So there may have been certain periods where it was more common to build all electric buildings. I wonder if that's okay.
Yeah, well, so we can certainly look at that. I mean, obviously we can see that in terms of age and the clusters between electric and gas, but also it'll be fairly quick to reach out to the housing providers and understand, you know, what the period of those retrofits were, and then we can apply that more broadly, I think. Yeah, so in terms of timing, we want to be on the ground. I'm still hoping actually before the end of February, and certainly my questions looking for input from this group relate a lot to how quickly we can get on the ground, how we partner with people and so on. So, but if we can get started, the plan will be to do 2 or 3 preliminaries where we'll probably deploy a couple of people from our team and would look to work with somebody from the housing provider as far as facilities management is concerned, so that we can really develop the audit approach and just make sure that what we have works, and we ask all the right questions, we have all the right pieces of information and places to put it. And then we should be able to then move to having just one person from our team working with somebody from the housing provider, which will allow us to probably double up and cover ground more quickly. Yeah, so I think the plan is, as I say, to really get those first 2 or 3 done between the end of February, second week in March, and then following up with the goal of trying to get them all done before the end of April. You know, we'll start to have some early input from those early buildings. We can start to analyze what we're finding and develop some sort of thumbnail sketches of what we think the issues are in time for that sort of first cycle of planning as far as policy input's concerned. So that's, I don't want to talk about which buildings and who just yet, because we haven't really quite finalized, but we do have a pretty good spread of buildings, both in terms of type, occupancy type, age, fuel use, obviously, and EUI. So there's a pretty big spread of EUIs from the sort of high 30s up into the 80s with some buildings, and that reflects somewhat age and use type, and also is vulnerable to the thing we've talked about before, that an EUI doesn't really reflect occupant density. And so that's one of the things that's at play in that conversation as well. So sorry, it's fairly general at the moment. I wish we were a little step further so I could put some charts and lists of buildings up and so on, but I'm just not quite at that point yet, but definitely will be before this. I think we will make this decision about buildings, at least the first tranche of buildings, in the next few days. We'll probably be reaching out to housing providers early next week to engage and start talking about the next step. But I'm really interested to know, you know, what information. So if we approach you to want to do an audit of one of your buildings, what information you need to know as part of that initial approach, how much lead time you need in order to accommodate that outreach, and who the right person is to be talking to and who the right person is to have actually on the audit participating. So those are my sort of big questions that I'd love to hear input on.
Alistair, I'll just say, tell me when, tell me where, give me a week's notice. We'll make it happen.
Awesome.
You're also welcome to reach out to me to see if we've weatherized the building previously. If we have, I'm happy to provide anything that we have available. Might take us, some things are in our physical archives. I don't know how that works these days, so it might take a little time to find it, but let me know and I'll definitely dig up whatever I can.
Yeah, that'll be great. That's one of the first phases will be discovery. Once we identify the buildings, we'll be kind of going to all the likely point sources for existing audit information, recent weatherization information, that kind of stuff. Yeah, but thank you.
Alistair, I'm curious what you're finding in terms of, you know, both the larger scale and then this group of buildings to be audited, the sort of the split of buildings that actually have gas heat versus electric in-unit electric resistance.
Right. And I got to say, I'm not sure if I can tell you that just off the top of my head.
Sure.
I think we don't. I think when we looked at it, Alistair, correct me if I'm wrong. I think the only data we had that has that was data from the Office of Housing, which is kind of self-reported and
Yeah, we don't.
not accurate, but we don't know how accurate.
Yeah, we don't have it as hard data, but I know one of the things that David has done is he's been looking for standard deviations in the gas consumption so that we can look at electric versus gas base load versus what might be seasonal loads. So we chose not to do a full regression on that because it just didn't seem necessary. But he was doing some simplified analysis of that. I'm just not seeing it in the data set at the moment that's called out, but it is one of the things that we're getting a trend on.
Sandra, I think the other complicating factor is a lot of buildings have common area gas heat, but electric in-unit heat. And a couple of Marty's buildings, the common area, heating the hallways was using more heat than heating all the units. So it's not always easy to tell from energy use where that gas heat is going.
Well, often the heated hallway heats the units.
You would think so, but we're not sure. The data doesn't always say that.
Okay.
Right. So just,
Yeah.
I think, if I'm getting this right, I think we have about 43 mixed fuel buildings here in the set. And if I'm understanding the notes here, there may only be 5 of them that have gas space heating, that we think has gas for space heating.
That sounds about right. From my experience in being in a lot of buildings.
Yeah, so about 10%, 10 to 12% maybe.
Does that sound right to everyone else?
Alistair, how important is it for you to see the inside of a unit?
Not at all. You know, I think if we can get access to couple of units just to confirm some details. It's good to have done that, but overall, we're looking more at envelope condition and central systems. I mean, obviously, we're going to know from input from the facilities management what the systems are in the units. So I think for the most part, the big ticket items here are going to be the central components and building envelope general condition. Yeah.
A question, the new energy code requires balanced ventilation. Depending on the size of the retrofit, are any of these retrofits going to trigger that requirement in units?
It's a good question. I know, Sandra, that question came up about what triggers energy code, right? And I have not dug into that detail yet, but it's certainly one of the things that's a question.
Well, it's typically like the space that's being impacted, so it might not be building wide, or if you're triggering substantial alteration, right? If the scope of the upgrade is, extending the useful life of the building significantly. And then there's always exemptions, which I don't, know off the top of it, but that's kind of like if the scope of the upgrade is going to be large enough to trigger substantial alteration, then that would likely be where you'd be triggering the balanced ventilation.
And there's this, I remember how is scope of upgrade defined in the code? I don't remember. Like substantial alteration, is it dollars or?
I believe there's a couple, I think it's dollars. There may also be, and I'm not an expert on the code itself, but dollars and then sort of like major system upgrades, sort of again with the idea that extends the useful life of the building.
I think SCDI just maybe updated their tip sheet on definitions and explanations of subalts. If you check that page, they have one there.
I just think we don't want to be surprised that, we electrify a system and it's $500,000 and suddenly that triggers needing to upgrade the whole ventilation system of the building. So
I just want to flag that Lori and in our office also brought this up as a significant concern. And I think just really having clarity about exactly what you're saying, like what's going to trigger that subalt requirement. And I don't know if we can make that part of the audit or just, or just at least incorporate it. Because I think that obviously has a big implication for then triggering larger funding needs as well and impacts on public funders. So appreciate that point.
And we can also check into that and follow up with some more information for this group.
Yep. And yep, the link that Seth just posted was exactly what I was thinking of. Nice job.
Alistair, can you speak a little bit about that idea of whether or not there could be a scope inclusion of this perspective? If that would be difficult, if that's not going to be probable? You're doing something else here. And so I'm wondering, is that a consideration that could come in, whether or not you have that connection between what's going to bump up into ventilation recovery?
Yes. Well, I think perhaps more broadly, understanding what the triggers are, and I'll certainly take a look at this tip sheet and make sure we've kind of got consciousness of that. If it becomes an issue and we wanted to think about what that might look like, then that would definitely expand the scope. I mean, there are things that we can capture as part of the audit, which will then inform what the implications would be of a ventilation upgrade. But for example, back to Bobby's point about how much access we need to units, if the solution was to go to a individual unit heat recovery ventilator installation in every unit, then obviously that would kind of trigger a different scope at the audit level, versus if there's already a central rooftop ventilation system that's either supplying or exhausting, you know, what would be the possibility of adding in further shafts and making that an energy recovery ventilator on the roof instead. So, you know, again, it'll depend on the equipment. That equipment inventory would be part of the audit scope anyway. So that would then give us at least baseline information for what a code compliance requirement might mean. But then in certain situations, it might mean we needed to go back in and take another look if that turned out to be an issue. And obviously the potential costs could be really significant in some buildings and not so much in others.
So you're basically going to be adding another little line of data in there that could be mined in the future in a different way from different eyes.
Yes, yeah. And I think, you know, understanding the details of, you know, the sub-alt trigger, what that looks like, you know, may help us determine whether, you know, how deep we go in the initial audit, whether that's a significant concern based on what we're looking at in terms of upgrades to the building. We can determine whether that's a risk or not.
You know, Alistair, one of the things that might be helpful for all of us is understanding what the outputs of the audits will be. You know, it seems to me you'll go into a building and I think what we may want to see is there's 6 things to do in this building. There's 6 systems. Here's the impact, you know, this is electrification or not. That's kind of a yes, no, but then this is sort of a rough guess on the impact of EUI, and here's the cost.
Yeah.
So if we're going to explore this menu or incentive-based thing, we can say, what if we applied that to the whole portfolio? You know, if we had these choices and these incentives and these options, how far would they get us toward the goals the city has for carbon reduction and so on, and what would it cost and so on. So I just think about, you know, maybe bring to this group what sort of the one-page output would be and how we can use that to do our analysis, because you know, before we start, that might be helpful. Yeah.
So certainly for the next meeting, we can show you what the draft output would look like. And it is very much with that kind of iterative impact approach and, you know, quantification of cost, what the significant physical issues might be, particular financial issues and so on.
So we are pretty much at time, just 1 minute shy of the end of our moment for whatever Zoom reality you've got coming next. I want to respect that hard stop there and thank everyone for contributing today. You will see notes from me, probably more copious than you'd prefer, but feel free to always reach out. Let us know if there are any other questions. If there's something that comes top of mind for you that you feel hasn't been discussed that should be on the agenda in the future, that is always super welcome, so that we know that we're, you know, getting everybody's thoughts together and reflecting on this time together to be very useful. Anything you'd like to add, Steve, as a head out?
No, I think the conversations were great, and let us know if we're using your time well and enough time for input. And do you have things, as Bambi said, you'd like to share that we're not getting to? We're here to hear from you all. So.
All right, well, everyone have a great afternoon.
Yeah,